Ethan Reynolds preferred the company of animals. At 16, he found conversations with cats and dogs easier than those with his classmates. While others at school worried about grades or social media followers, Ethan worried about the skittish calico at the animal shelter who still wouldn't eat from his hand. Every Saturday, like clockwork, Ethan biked to the Pinebrook Animal Rescue. He'd sweep floors, refill water bowls, and, his favorite part, spend time with the animals, talking to them in a soft voice that came naturally. It was the one place he felt truly needed. That Saturday afternoon was no different. The sun was starting to dip low in the sky as Ethan zipped up his hoodie, slung on his backpack, and climbed onto his bike. He decided to take the wooded shortcut home, a narrow trail behind the shelter that curved through tall pines. It was quieter, cooler, and free of the traffic and noise he always tried to avoid. About halfway through the path, Ethan spotted something he hadn't noticed before. A structure, barely visible through the overgrown brush, stood hunched beneath a tangle of ivy and vines. Its wooden frame was warped, paint peeled in long strips like old bandages. One shutter hung loose on a broken hinge, creaking softly in the breeze. Curiosity nudged him closer. He dropped his bike and walked through the undergrowth, brushing away thorns and weeds. Up close, the building looked like it had once been a small house or shed, maybe even part of an old farm. The door was partly open, sagging slightly, like it hadn't been touched in years. Ethan stepped inside. The air smelled of damp wood and dust, and the room was dim, lit only by streaks of sunlight piercing through cracks in the roof. His eyes adjusted, and then he saw them. Cats, a dozen, maybe more, scattered throughout the room. Some perched silently on rafters. Others nestled in dusty corners or beneath broken furniture. All of them thin, skeletal even. Their eyes watched him, some fearful, others hopeful. His breath caught in his throat. One brave orange tabby approached slowly, head low, tail flicking. Ethan crouched down, holding out his hand. "Hey, buddy," he whispered. The cat sniffed his fingers, then rubbed against them with a soft purr. Ethan's heart squeezed. Most of the cats looked too weak to move much, and there was no sign of food or clean water. Someone must have abandoned them here, or maybe the building had once been used to shelter strays, long before anyone cared to keep it up. Ethan sat for nearly an hour, moving slowly, murmuring to them. The orange tabby stayed closest, never straying far from Ethan's side. When the wind picked up outside and clouds began to gather overhead, Ethan knew he had to leave. He had no idea how to help them, not yet, but he couldn't forget them either. He stood, brushing dust from his jeans. The orange tabby followed him to the doorway. "I'll be back," Ethan promised. As he reached for his bike, thunder cracked across the sky, and rain began to fall in heavy sheets. The trees shuddered in the wind, and the path he'd taken to get there quickly turned to mud. Great, he hadn't planned for this. He tried the trail anyway, guiding his bike while slipping on the slick ground. Within minutes, he was disoriented. The trees looked different, and the narrow trail had vanished in the storm. The sky darkened fast, and anxiety started to creep in. That's when he heard a soft meow behind him. He turned. The orange tabby, soaked but determined, had followed him. "You again," Ethan said, half laughing. The cat trotted a few feet ahead, then stopped, looking back as if expecting him to follow. "Are you leading me?" Another meow, another few steps. With no better idea, Ethan followed. Through the rain and trees, the orange tabby stayed just ahead, turning back now and then to make sure Ethan was still there. Eventually, the familiar outline of the main road came into view. Ethan exhaled in disbelief. They had made it. He scooped up the shivering tabby in his arms. "I'm calling you Rusty," he said, cradling the cat close. "And I owe you one." As the rain eased and the last light faded behind the trees, Ethan turned toward home, his heart already fixed on the shelter tomorrow and the forgotten cats he wouldn't leave behind. The next morning, Ethan barely touched his cereal. Images of the cats haunted him. The sunken eyes, trembling limbs, and matted fur. He had never seen anything like it, not even at the shelter where neglected strays were often brought in. These cats were beyond forgotten. They were surviving ghosts. He tossed his spoon in the sink, grabbed his backpack, and wheeled his bike onto the driveway. The storm had passed, but the air still smelled like wet leaves and bark. He didn't tell his mom where he was going. She'd just worry. The shortcut trail was still muddy, and his tires occasionally slipped on wet roots. But Ethan's focus was fixed. When he reached the overgrown clearing, his breath caught again. The building, dilapidated and half swallowed by the woods, looked even worse in the morning light. He pushed through the brush and stepped carefully through the crooked doorway. The wooden floor groaned under his sneakers. A shaft of sunlight lit up dust motes swirling in the air, and from the shadows, eyes blinked back at him. They were still there, watching, waiting. Ethan set down his backpack and slowly unzipped it. He had packed cans of wet food, a water bottle, and a few old towels. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled out the can opener. A few soft clinks of metal echoed off the cracked walls, followed by the unmistakable smell of tuna and chicken. That was all it took. Cats began to emerge from the corners, cautiously, one at a time. A gray tabby with a limp, a wide-eyed black kitten barely the size of a glove, a patched tortoiseshell with ragged ears. They moved like they hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks. Ethan gently placed small portions across the floor on the towel scraps. He didn't try to pet them, didn't reach out. He knew better. Trust would take time. One figure stood apart. The orange tabby from yesterday, Rusty, sat on an overturned crate watching him. Ethan met his eyes. "You remember me, huh?" Rusty blinked slowly, then hopped down. With a graceful stretch, he padded over and sniffed Ethan's outstretched hand. Then, cautiously, he rubbed his head against Ethan's fingers. A soft purr vibrated under the cat's ribs. Something tightened in Ethan's chest. This was more than trust. This was the beginning of something deeper. He looked around the crumbling interior. Now that he was seeing it in daylight, pieces of the mystery began to fall into place. There were rusted metal cages stacked along the far wall. A moldy clipboard hung beside a long-forgotten corkboard filled with tattered flyers. In the back, he even found an old supply closet. Empty shelves covered in claw marks and dust. This place wasn't just abandoned. It had been an animal shelter. Long ago, Ethan knelt beside one of the cages and found a half-torn label stuck to the bars. The ink had faded, but he could just make out the name. Pinebrook Rescue Annex. His mind reeled. He knew Pinebrook Rescue, the main shelter where he volunteered, but he'd never heard anyone mention an annex. How long had this building been left to rot? And why had no one come for the animals? He stood, brushing his hands on his jeans, suddenly aware of the quiet. All the cats had eaten. Some had curled up into tentative sleep. Rusty still stood close, tail flicking gently against Ethan's calf. "I'll come back," Ethan whispered. "I promise." As he turned to leave, Rusty followed. Not quite as far as the trail this time, but close enough that Ethan had to crouch down again. "You're something else," he said with a smile. "Smart, brave, and stubborn. I get it." He reached into his pack and pulled out a spare towel. Laying it near the door, he patted it gently. Rusty circled once, then lay down. Tail wrapped tightly around his body, golden eyes tracking Ethan until he disappeared into the trees. Back on the trail, Ethan's mind was racing. The main shelter had to know something about this old annex. Maybe an old volunteer, maybe one of the staff remembered. But more than that, he had to do something. These cats couldn't wait forever. That night, he scribbled notes furiously in a spiral-bound notebook, drawing maps of the building's layout and listing every cat he could remember. Rusty had already claimed a corner of his thoughts, a forgotten shelter, a hidden group of survivors, and one cat who led him back through the storm. It wasn't just a shortcut anymore. It was a mission. Ethan didn't tell anyone about the cats. Not yet. He began waking up earlier on weekends, sneaking out before breakfast with a backpack full of supplies. Cans of food, water, old towels, and sometimes a toy or two he borrowed from the shelter's donation bin. He rode the wooded trail with growing confidence, mud splattering his jeans, heart thudding not from fear, but purpose. The cats were waiting. Each time he arrived, more of them emerged from the shadows. Their eyes weren't as hollow anymore. Their steps had gained strength. He named them quietly Whiskers, Luna, Midge, Socks. But it was Rusty who always greeted him first, bounding down from his usual perch near the window like a sentry watching for his return. Rusty wasn't like the others. He was a leader, bold, sharp-eyed, and protective. When food was laid out, he let the weaker cats eat first. When a raccoon sniffed around the back of the building one morning, it was Rusty's growls that chased it off. Ethan began talking to him as if he were human. "You're keeping this whole place together," he'd say, crouched beside him, stroking the fur between Rusty's shoulder blades. "Don't worry, I'm gonna fix this." But fixing it meant understanding how it happened in the first place. On a gray Saturday, Ethan brought a flashlight and a small notebook. After feeding the cats and checking their water buckets, he explored the back rooms of the crumbling shelter. Most of the rooms were falling apart, but some still held secrets. One had a warped file cabinet, half collapsed under its own weight. With some effort, Ethan yanked open the bottom drawer. Inside, soggy folders stuck together in clumps. He flipped carefully through the mess until a single file caught his eye. It was marked Pinebrook Rescue Annex, Final Report. Most of the pages were too water-damaged to read, but a few lines were still legible. Due to funding cuts and code violations, the Pinebrook Annex will be closed indefinitely. All animals must be transferred to the main shelter by. The date had blurred, but the year was clear. 2011. That was over 10 years ago. Ethan's brow furrowed. Transferred? Then what happened to these cats? A gust of wind rattled the window frame behind him, and he flinched. Dust rained from the ceiling. He realized then just how unstable this place was. He found more clues near the old reception desk. A cracked binder labeled Daily Logs. Most entries were dull. Feeding times, intake names, cleaning schedules. But the final page chilled him. Storm warning issued. Evacuation checklist incomplete. Will return tomorrow to finish. There were no entries after that. A storm. A rushed evacuation. No return. Somehow, the cats had never been retrieved. Ethan stood in the silent lobby, listening to the faint creaks of a dying building. How many volunteers had walked away, thinking someone else would come back? How had a whole shelter been forgotten for so long? Back in the main room, Rusty was waiting, his amber eyes steady on Ethan's face. "I'm not leaving you behind," Ethan said softly, crouching beside him. Rusty leaned into his hand, and for the first time, purred loud and long. That afternoon, Ethan biked back with a plan forming in his head. He couldn't keep this secret forever. The cats needed more than he could carry in a backpack. They needed medical care, clean shelter, and someone who would make sure they were never forgotten again. But people wouldn't believe him without proof. That night, he borrowed his mom's old camera from the closet and charged it quietly in his room. He packed extra batteries and memory cards. If he wanted to save them, he had to show the world what he had found. In his notebook, he scribbled, Step 1, photograph the shelter and every cat. Step 2, ask Mrs. Halprin at the main shelter about the annex. Step 3, tell someone. Maybe the news, maybe school, but his next words were the most important. Step 4, don't let them disappear again. Outside, a soft rain began to fall. Inside the old shelter, Rusty curled on a pile of towels, his ears twitching toward the wind, waiting. Ethan didn't mean to stay so late. The clouds had looked harmless when he arrived at the old shelter, just a dull smear across the sky. But time always slipped when he was with the cats. He'd been busy photographing them one by one, jotting notes in his worn notebook. Rusty, of course, followed him everywhere, sometimes ducking into the corners of shots as if posing on purpose. It wasn't until a gust of cold wind blew through the broken roof tiles that Ethan finally looked up. The sky was darker now, thick and angry. Thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. "Shoot!" he muttered, shoving his camera into his backpack. The trees were already beginning to sway. He called out to the cats one last time, watching them scatter into their hiding spots. Rusty lingered by the door, tail flicking, waiting for Ethan. "Come on," Ethan said, zipping his jacket up tight. "Let's go before it hits." They didn't make it far. 10 minutes into the trail, the storm rolled in hard. Rain came down like someone had dumped buckets from the clouds. Wind howled through the trees, turning branches into flailing arms. The dirt path turned to sludge beneath Ethan's bike tires, slowing him down. Then lightning cracked overhead and everything changed. A tree had fallen, blocking the trail ahead. Ethan slammed the brakes, skidding sideways and tumbling into the mud. He groaned, soaking wet and winded. Rusty darted beside him, his fur slick with rain, meowing loudly. "I'm okay," Ethan said breathlessly, wiping his face. But when he looked up, nothing looked familiar. The trail had forked at some point, and in the panic he'd taken the wrong turn. He was lost. His heart pounded, not just from the cold or the fear of being alone in the woods, but the thought of what could happen if he didn't find the way back before dark. The storm was relentless. The trees blurred in every direction. His phone had no signal. He sat down on a rock, trying to control his breathing. Rusty jumped onto his lap, despite the wet. He let out a single meow, then stared into Ethan's eyes, steady, calm, focused. "You're not worried?" Ethan whispered, more to himself than to Rusty. "You've done this before, haven't you?" Rusty meowed again, jumped down, and trotted a few paces ahead, then stopped and turned. Waiting. Ethan blinked. "Are you leading me?" Rusty meowed once more and continued walking. Not too fast, just enough to keep Ethan moving. With nothing else to go on, Ethan followed. The storm didn't let up, but something about Rusty's pace kept him going. The cat moved with purpose, skirting muddy slopes, avoiding thick bramble, weaving under branches like he knew this path intimately. At one point, Ethan slipped again, scraping his hand on a jagged rock. He cursed under his breath, but Rusty circled back, brushing against his leg before moving on. It was as if Rusty knew he needed reassurance just to keep walking. Eventually, through the wall of rain and wind, Ethan spotted something that made him stop cold. A small wooden bridge, one he recognized. "Wait," he whispered. "I've been here. This leads out near the old mill road." Rusty stopped on the other side of the bridge, tail twitching, waiting for him to catch up. Ethan crossed it, each step squelching beneath his muddy boots. He paused next to Rusty, heart racing. Not from fear this time, but from relief. In the distance, through the curtain of rain, he could see the faint outline of the neighborhood streetlights. He was safe. He looked down at Rusty, who stood proud, as if this was all part of the plan. "You did that," Ethan said softly, kneeling despite the mud. "You got me home." Rusty rubbed against his arm, purring despite the rain, as if to say, "Of course I did." Back home, soaked to the bone and exhausted, Ethan wrapped Rusty in an old towel and held him close. That night, lying in bed with the storm still echoing outside, Ethan stared at the ceiling. His legs ached, his hands throbbed, but his heart felt full, like something had shifted. Rusty wasn't just a rescue anymore. He was family. Ethan hadn't stopped thinking about the storm or Rusty's brave guidance. All night, even though he had dried off and patched his scraped hand, a deep ache lingered in his chest. Not just from the fear of being lost, but from what he'd left behind in that crumbling old building. Those cats, alone, cold, surviving by instinct, barely clinging to a life they didn't choose. He couldn't ignore them anymore. The next morning, Ethan pushed open the door to the local animal rescue, still damp from the morning fog. The bell above the door jingled, and the familiar smell of straw, cleaning solution, and animal musk filled the air. Julie, the center's lead coordinator, glanced up from behind the desk. "Morning, Ethan. You're early. I need to talk to you," he said, his voice firmer than usual. Julie raised a brow. "Everything okay?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, heart pounding, then launched into his story. He told them everything. The forgotten shelter hidden in the woods, the half-starved cats, the storm, and how Rusty had saved him. His words tumbled out in a rush, raw and earnest. Another volunteer nearby, a younger guy named Nate, chuckled lightly. "You sure it wasn't just an old shack? Cats wander, doesn't mean it was a real shelter." "It was," Ethan insisted. "There were old cages, rusted nameplates, and faded posters on the walls. And the cats, they're not just strays. They stay near the building, like they're waiting for something." Julie looked thoughtful but uncertain. "That area hasn't had a licensed shelter in over 10 years. Most closed due to funding or violations. I haven't heard anything about a place out there." Just as Ethan's heart began to sink, a voice spoke up from behind them. "I've heard of it." Everyone turned. It was Tom, the oldest volunteer at the rescue. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, but he'd worked with animals longer than anyone else. His weathered face looked unreadable, but his eyes were sharp. "You have?" Ethan asked, surprised. Tom nodded slowly. "Used to be a place called Cedar Hollow Animal Haven. Opened almost 20 years ago. Run by a family, I think. Then the funding dried up and one day it just stopped. No closure notice. No transfer records. It just disappeared." Julie blinked. "You never mentioned that before." Tom shrugged. "Didn't think it mattered. Thought the place was torn down years ago." "It's still there," Ethan said, more certain now. "And the cats never left." There was a pause. Then Julie stood, her tone shifting from cautious to curious. "Well, if there are animals in need, we can't ignore that. Maybe it's worth checking out." Tom gave Ethan a nod. "You'll take us there?" Ethan nodded quickly. "Yes, I'll show you." Later that afternoon, with the storm past and the sky beginning to clear, Ethan returned to the woods, this time with Tom, Julie, and 2 other volunteers. He led them carefully down the trail, pointing out the muddy bend and the broken bridge that had saved him. Rusty trotted ahead of the group like a tour guide, tail high and proud. When they reached the shelter, everyone grew quiet. The building stood as Ethan had described it. Half-collapsed roof, walls covered in ivy, and an eerie stillness. But then came the sounds, soft meows echoing from within. Julie gasped softly as they stepped inside. "Good grief," she murmured, eyes scanning the shadowy corners. "They're really here." One by one, cats began emerging from their hiding spots. Skittish at first, then curious. Their ribs were visible, fur matted, but their eyes were bright, hopeful. Rusty stayed by Ethan's feet but looked up at him knowingly. Tom crouched and shook his head. Poor souls, forgotten for years, yet still holding on. Julie pulled out her phone. "I'll call the shelter. We need food, carriers, and a mobile vet. We've got work to do." As the team began coordinating efforts, Ethan stood quietly, watching the cats move around. For the first time, he didn't feel like just a kid who preferred animals over people. He felt like someone who had made a difference. Rusty brushed against his leg and purred. "You found me," Ethan whispered, "and now we're going to find them all." Ethan stood at the edge of the woods again, but this time he wasn't alone. A line of vans and volunteers stretched behind him, crates in hand, clipboards at the ready, bags of food and blankets stacked in the back seats. Julie had rallied the rescue center's full team, and word had spread fast. The town's animal lovers, high school students, even a local news crew had shown up to help. Rusty sat proudly on a nearby rock, as if waiting for them. Ethan took a deep breath and nodded. This way. As they hiked the narrow path through the trees, the energy was electric. A few people chatted quietly, others walked in silence, but all followed Ethan and Rusty, who trotted ahead like he'd been preparing for this moment all along. The broken remnants of the forgotten shelter emerged through the foliage once again, but this time it felt different. The building was still battered, but no longer lost. Not invisible. People had come. They saw it, and they were ready. Rusty meowed loudly as they approached the entrance. A few cats peeked from behind broken crates and rusted doors. Then more appeared, tentative, curious, wide-eyed. "They're coming out," someone whispered. One by one, the volunteers dropped to their knees and opened carriers, speaking gently, offering food, extending gloved hands. The cats, thin, wary, but alive, began to inch forward. Julie moved quickly, assigning teams to sections of the building, marking down counts and conditions. "We'll do triage at the center. Check for infections, malnourishment. Some might need isolation, but we'll find a way to keep them together for now." Tom nodded, coaxing a long-haired gray cat into a crate with surprising ease. "They've survived worse. They'll make it." Ethan hung back at first, watching. His heart swelled as cat after cat was safely gathered, no longer ghosts in the shadows. He stepped inside the building and looked at the spot where he had first met Rusty. The orange tabby padded in beside him, giving a soft chirp. "You started this?" Ethan said, kneeling beside him. "You didn't let me forget." Rusty rubbed against his hand, then darted off to lead another cat from behind a crate. Ethan laughed, for the first time in days, and followed him. By midday, over 20 cats had been safely rescued. Some were easier than others. A few took coaxing, others were trapped gently with food. One even leapt into a volunteer's arms. They were frightened, but not feral. They'd been waiting for someone to come back, and now someone had. News of the rescue had spread throughout the town. Locals showed up with donations, towels, kibble, even old scratching posts. A retired carpenter offered to board up the shelter temporarily to keep it from collapsing further. A group of high schoolers started a donation page online, and within hours, it had already gathered over $1,000. The community, once unaware of the forgotten place deep in the woods, was now coming together to give it, and the cats, a second chance. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the last of the carriers were loaded into the vans, Ethan stood beside Julie, watching the bustle around them. "You did something important today," she said, her voice soft. "I just found them," Ethan replied. Julie shook her head. "You found them. You fed them. You told us. You led us here. That's not just something. That's everything." Ethan looked down at Rusty, who had once again taken his place at Ethan's side like a quiet guardian. "He's the reason I kept coming back," Ethan said. "He wouldn't let me give up." Julie smiled. "Then maybe he found you, too." As the last door closed on the transport van and the engine started, Ethan felt something he hadn't in a long time: purpose. Not just for the cats, but for himself. The boy who once found it easier to connect with animals than people had become the thread that brought both together. Rusty brushed against his leg, and Ethan reached down to scoop him up. The cat settled in his arms, purring quietly. "We'll come back tomorrow," Ethan whispered. "There's still work to do, and this time he wouldn't be doing it alone." The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of the newly renovated shelter, casting warm rays across the tiled floor. The once forgotten building had transformed into a vibrant space filled with soft blankets, clean enclosures, and the gentle hum of contented purrs. A new wooden sign, freshly carved and proudly hung near the entrance, read, "Rusty's Refuge, a second chance for the forgotten." Ethan stood just beneath it, Rusty nestled in his arms. The orange tabby's eyes were half closed, his purrs rumbling gently against Ethan's chest. It had only been a few weeks since the rescue, but the world already felt different. The town had rallied beyond anything Ethan expected. Donations poured in. Volunteers signed up daily. A local builder donated materials, and a retired architect helped design a new wing just for harder-to-place cats. Older, shy, or special needs. It was a place for those who might be overlooked. The kind of place Rusty had once needed. Now it bore his name. Ethan walked through the new wing, pausing by a window bench where an elderly black and white cat snoozed in the sun. Across the room, a group of school kids giggled as a curious kitten chased their shoelaces. The room felt alive, not just with animals but with hope. "Hey, there you are!" Julie's voice came from the hallway. She stepped inside, holding a clipboard and wearing a smile that hadn't faded since the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Everything looks great. You proud? Ethan nodded, stroking Rusty behind the ears. Yeah, I am. Julie tapped her pen thoughtfully. You know, when you first told me about that place in the woods, I wasn't sure what we'd find. But I never expected it to lead to this. Me neither, Ethan admitted. I couldn't leave them there. You didn't. And now they've got something better. You gave them that. Ethan glanced around at the cats, the clean space, the filled food bowls, and the volunteers quietly working. He exhaled slowly, the tension that once lived in his shoulders now replaced by something steadier. Purpose. Julie flipped a page on her clipboard. Also, paperwork went through this morning. Rusty's officially yours now. Adoption finalized. Ethan looked down. Rusty blinked up at him, as if he already knew. Thanks, Ethan said, voice soft. Julie smiled. I think he picked you long before you picked him. As she walked off to check on another room, Ethan made his way to a quiet corner where a wide cushion had been placed by a window. His favorite spot to sit with Rusty. He settled down, Rusty curling in his lap without hesitation. Through the window, Ethan could see the edge of the forest, the same woods where he'd found the old shelter, where he'd been caught in the storm, where everything had started. He thought back to the first time he saw Rusty, standing bravely in that crumbling building, unafraid, as if he'd been waiting for someone to arrive. That moment had changed everything. At the time, Ethan had felt lost, uncertain of where he fit in the world. But that cat, that hidden place, had called something out of him. Courage, compassion, leadership, things he hadn't known he carried. He looked down at Rusty. You saved me too, you know? Rusty responded with a soft, raspy meow and nestled deeper into his lap. Outside, more people arrived. Families with children, teenagers looking to help, even a reporter taking photos of the new wing. But inside, Ethan felt still, peaceful. This was where he belonged. As the sun dipped lower in the sky and the shelter buzzed gently around him, Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, hand resting on Rusty's back. The forgotten shelter was no longer forgotten, and neither was he.